This is Shalom World Podcast.
Welcome to Voyage. I am your host, Francis Hogan. The book of Exodus, chapter 24. I want to read a very special part of this text for you. It is really beautiful. It's immediately after the elders and Aaron had this wonderful experience of God. So this begins in chapter 24 from verse 12. The Lord said to Moses, "Come up to me on the mountain." Now this is a very personal invitation. Come up to me. This isn't just any human being finally having access to God. This is very personal. And I want you to wait there. And I will give you the tables of stone with the law and the commandment. That's the Debarim and the Mishpatim, the two different, the 10 commandments and the instructions, which I have written for their instruction. This is verse 13. So Moses rose with his servant Joshua, and Moses went up into the mountain of God. Notice Joshua didn't. Joshua goes only about halfway. At this point, Joshua is Moses' servant and disciple, and eventually he will replace him as leader, just like the apostles were first of all Jesus' servants and his disciples, and then they took over after his death and resurrection. So Joshua has to learn from Moses about intimacy with God, because this is a spiritual kingdom. This is a consecrated nation, and therefore it isn't just natural laws they have. The laws are actually God's law, and it's God's will. So Moses said to the elders, "Wait here for us until we come to you again. And behold, Aaron and Hur are with you. Whoever has a cause, let them go to them." This is very important for introducing the crisis that we're going to meet with in chapter 32, and that is that Aaron and Hur have been put in charge while Moses is away. Now, notice that Moses is aware of the fact that he's going to be away for a time. He doesn't know the full length of time, but he does know he's going to be away. He does not abandon the people. He does not leave them just running around with no leadership. He actually puts Aaron and Hur, a priest and a layman, in charge of them. And Hur, these are the two that helped Moses in his intercession for the people in their battle against the Amalekites. Verse 15. Then Moses went up on the mountain, and the cloud covered the mountain. Now the cloud represents the mysterious presence of God. A cloud both reveals the sun and conceals it at the same time. And no matter how much we enter into union with God and into prayer, no matter how much we know God, he is still complete and total mystery to us. So the cloud covered the mountain. The glory of the Lord settled on Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it for 6 days. They're the 6 working days. And on the 7th day, that is the Shabbat or the Sabbath, he called to Moses out of the midst of the cloud. So God waits for the rest day in order to call Moses. Verse 17. Now the appearance of the glory of the Lord was like a devouring fire on the top of the mountain in the sight of the sons of Israel. So from a distance, the presence of God seemed like a devouring fire. But that's not what is being described for Moses. Moses is simply going into the mystery of God's presence, and there's no devouring fire. But it's from a distance. And this is one of the problems of every generation, and that is depending on your distance from union with God will depend on how you actually perceive him. The glory of the Lord was like a devouring fire on the top of the mountain in the sight of the sons of Israel. And Moses entered the cloud. Now notice, didn't enter a fire. He entered the cloud. He entered the mystery of God's presence and went up the mountain. And Moses was on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. Does that mean 39 plus 1? The answer is no. Because numbers are used symbolically throughout the Bible. And 40 is a number that represents a period in which a person or a group are in preparation for some great intervention of God. Like you're told that Jesus spent 40 days in the desert. The people spent 40 years in the wilderness. So you have to ask the question, is that 39 plus 1? Because we're very mathematical and very precise about things, and we don't understand people speaking a prophetic language, a language in which they communicate messages, not only with numbers, but with symbols and everything. And so whatever length of time Moses spent on the mountain, it was very fruitful. I think in modern day language, we could call it a summit meeting, that he goes to the summit of the mountain. He's meeting the greatest authority in heaven and on earth, and he himself is the greatest authority for the people of God. So yes, it's a summit meeting. And this call, which came after he and the elders and the priests had their experience of intimacy with God, he's called into a deeper one. And he's called by himself. Even Joshua is not allowed to go into this deepest place with God. In other words, the mediator is in a very special position with God. And the mediator is given privileges that nobody else is given. So you could ask the question, what kind of business went on between Moses and God for that length of time, whatever length of time it was? And the answer, of course, is the Debarim and the Mishpatim. In other words, all the instruction that came from Moses came from that experience he had with God. And you're going to see from chapter 25 onwards that all the instruction about the tabernacle, about the priesthood, about the worship, about the sacrificial system, everything comes from this experience. And Moses is told very clearly, you keep to the pattern that was shown to you on the mountain. In other words, there was some kind of a heavenly pattern of how to worship God correctly shown on this mountain, which is very, very important. So officially, Moses is receiving the divine revelation of God's will for the human race. Now, why did the people perceive this presence as a devouring fire? Because they are not yet really committed to God. We're going to see that very clearly in chapter 32. They haven't given their hearts to God. They're not converted, as we would say. And so they had an experience which told them about the untouchable holiness of God. That's a devouring fire. You don't go near it. And this untouchable holiness of God will not tolerate sin. I'm introducing chapter 32. Hebrews 12:14, nothing unholy or unworthy can enter the presence of God. It's that simple. That's why these priests and elders could only go into the presence of God after the covenant, after they had offered atonement sacrifices. And once they went to the communion sacrifices, yes, they could have experience of God. What Exodus is really saying is that no creature in rebellion against God would dare approach him. And of course, we've got lots of saints and mystics who have told us that when a soul passes on in death, that when they see the presence and glory and holiness of God, many of them plunge themselves willingly into the fires of purgatory so that someday they will have that presence. They will have the ability to have that extraordinary union. And so they will go through the purgatorium, or the purification that's actually necessary for that. I want to read a few verses from the book of Sirach, chapter 45, verses 1 to 6, and it's about Moses. They look back at this extraordinary man who had a one-to-one relationship with God. I mean, Moses' relationship with God was out of all proportion to anything that Abraham had, even though Abraham is celebrated as the father of all those who believe. This is the book of Sirach, or Ecclesiasticus, other Bibles call it. Sirach is the author. From his descendants, the Lord brought forth a man of mercy, who found favor in the sight of all flesh, and was beloved by God and men. Moses, whose memory is blessed. He made him equal in glory to the holy ones. Now, the holy ones, you're talking about the angels, and made him great in the fears of his enemies. That's his wonderful success in Egypt, for example. By his words, he caused signs to cease. That's stopping the plagues of Egypt. The Lord glorified him in the presence of kings and gave him commands for his people and showed him part of his glory, because you can't see God and live. He sanctified him through faithfulness and meekness. He was called the meekest man on earth in Numbers 12, verses 1 to 3. And chose him out of all mankind. He made him hear his voice and led him into the thick darkness and gave him the commandments face to face, the law of life and knowledge. Notice the law of life and knowledge. That means that we would be able to come to grips with what the divine will of God actually wants of us. And it was to teach Jacob. That means the descendants of Jacob, or the chosen people. So we have this absolutely extraordinary person called into this extraordinary union with God. So Moses goes into the cloud, and we too, because of Jesus, through him, with him, and in him, can go into the cloud of God's presence. And we can have intimacy with God because we are baptized into Christ. We are actually part of him. And so we pray through him. It's actually his prayer to the Father, and we put our little drop of water in the wine of his prayer and his intercession, and so on. And we're going to see that when Moses comes down the mountain again, that he's actually transformed by this experience. And this is what St. Paul tells us in the New Testament in 2 Corinthians 3:18. And we with our unveiled faces behold the glory of the Lord. We have this privilege because we're part of Christ. He said, I am the vine, you are my branches. You're actually part of me. And because of that, we can behold the glory of the Lord, not because of ourselves. We with our unveiled faces behold the glory of the Lord, and we are being transformed into the same image from one degree of glory to another. In other words, the more you stay as a person of prayer, the more close you come to God, the more you become like him in your thoughts, in your words, in your actions, your whole life, everything. We even say that a person is Christ-like. Now, these 40 days of Moses on the mountain, of course, prophetically forecast the 40 days of Jesus in the future. In Deuteronomy 18, verses 18 and 19, God says, I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brethren. I will put my words in his mouth, and it shall be that whoever shall hear my words, which he speaks in my name, if someone doesn't do it, I will requite it of him. Now, I haven't given you the whole thing. He said you're to listen to him, and if you don't listen to him, you'll have to answer to God, is what it's saying there. And Jesus went up the mountain. He ascended back into the presence of God. He's there ever living to make intercession for us. And he will come back in glory. And he's going to come back twice, just as Moses can come down the mountain twice. And I will illustrate that for you as well. In a letter to the Hebrews, chapter 4, verse 10, for whoever enters God's rest ceases from his labors. Of course, it's at the end of labor. Moses goes up into that presence of God, and actually, while he receives an enormous revelation from God, at the same time, it is rest, because union with God is rest for the soul. You're no longer striving for all kinds of stuff that worldly people are striving for. If you ask the question, what did God actually reveal to Moses for that 40 days, then you read chapters 25 to 40 of the book of Exodus. The rest of it is all there. God asked him to build a house for him on earth. And since they were traveling through a wilderness and they had not arrived at their destination, initially he accepted a tent, which is called the tent of meeting. And then he showed them how to build a tabernacle, much more bigger structure, which they could actually build and dismantle and carry from one place to the next. But finally, they actually built a temple for him in Jerusalem. He wanted a house on earth. building of the house of God. This was revealed on the mountain, and that is the origin of the way our churches are actually put together. And I will deal with that when we get there. We're going to learn an awful lot about what it means to have a building that is correct. Some of our buildings nowadays are not correct, but some of them are. What do I mean by some of them are? Moses is told very, very clearly in Exodus 25, verse 40, see that you make everything according to the pattern that was shown you on the mountain. In other words, he was given a vision of what the thing actually looked like. And he obviously saw it in such extraordinary detail that when you go into chapters 25 to 40, the measurements that are given to you in absolute detail are mesmerizing. So if he got all these measurements from God, there's something about them that's saying something about the right way to do God's house. And we'll look into that at another time. So the place was to be a tent of meeting. Tent meaning you're in a wilderness, you're moving from place to place. So you're all living in tents, and I live in a tent as well. So this tent was to be a place where God would meet his own people, and his own people could meet God truly. That's why it was called the tent of meeting. And you'll find that when you read the book of Numbers, that this tent of meeting becomes extremely important for Moses and for the people as they travel through the wilderness. Now, according to the instruction that was given from heaven, this tent of meeting, if it's put up correctly, is a place where acceptable worship could take place. In other words, you had to do it properly. You didn't just slaughter animals and throw the blood anywhere and eat them if you want to and don't eat them if you don't want them. You can't do that. There's a proper way of doing things. It was going to be a place where acceptable atonement was going to be given to God, in lieu, of course, of Calvary, where all the grace for this would come. And it's the place where the heavenly business between a priestly people and their God would actually take place. We call that liturgy. All that needs to be said and expressed through certain people who represent us, yes, all of that had to go on as well. And it was from there, from this tent of meeting, that God was going to act as the guide of his people, and he was going to become their good shepherd. Now, when you read Psalm 23, you're reading what they experienced. The Lord is my shepherd, I don't lack anything. He guides me along the right path, and even if I'm going through a very dark place, I have his guidance and his discipline to actually guide me to the right place. That was their experience in the wilderness. And therefore, they were going to get there. They were going to arrive. Only goodness and kindness would follow me all the days of my life. In other words, if God was with them, and we're going to see in chapters 32 to 34, God being with them is a massive issue. Because if they break the commandments as much as they do in chapter 32, then everything has to be renegotiated again. So it was necessary. In the letter to the Hebrews, chapter 9, verse 23, it says, it was necessary for the copies of the heavenly things to be purified with these rites. But then when you come to Christ, you're dealing with the actual heavenly things, because it's God himself who is among us. And you watch what he did and what he wanted the people to do. Okay, so a little preview of what's coming, and that is that Moses will descend the mountain twice. Once in Exodus 32:15, and the second time in Exodus 34 from verses 29 to 35. And this, of course, prophetically points forward to the fact that Jesus comes back to us twice. And you're told in Acts chapter 1, verse 11, that he will return in the same way as you have seen him go. So he returned into the mystery of the cloud of God's mysterious presence, and he will return that way as well. Now, when Moses descends the mountain the first time, and he sees the people absolutely in dreadful apostasy and committing very serious sin, he becomes their judge. And he deals with the problem, and he's not going to allow the cancer of sin to actually take hold among the people. They were only at the very beginning of their lives. When you go to the Acts of the Apostles in chapter 5, you find the very beginning of the community that we call the church. And we find St. Peter dealing very strongly with Ananias and Sapphira, because the cancer of deceit must not get into the church. And it's the same idea, that they have to deal with a problem right at its very roots. And it was to try and save the entire people from being destroyed. Because we're going to find that when Jesus returns in the coming we are expecting, that he's going to cleanse the earth of the dreadful apostasy that's in the earth today. He has to, in order that the church can rise again and go into a new era of divine holiness. When he comes in the final, as we say, last day time, it's in glory. And when Moses comes down the second time, he comes down with the glory of God all over him, to the point where even Aaron and the elders were actually afraid of him. And so the descent of Moses twice is actually quite important. The first time, he sees that the people have reverted back to paganism, and he has to purify it. When Jesus returns now, he's going to see that the world has reverted back to paganism, and he's going to have to deal with it. Otherwise, there's no glorious future coming. If this problem isn't dealt with, you can't have the future. You can have the glorious future if the problem is dealt with. And so when you read about this in the book of Exodus, and you haven't sort of read it in the context of the whole Bible and the whole of history, it may seem to you very terrible. In the same way, when the great chastisement comes upon the earth, because Jesus is not going to come back into a sewer, nothing unholy or unworthy can enter the presence of God. And Habakkuk 1:13 says, Lord, you are too holy to look upon sin. So he has to deal with it. And once he deals with it, then yes, the people of God can go on, and the new era of divine holiness can actually come to us. So now I want to jump from chapter 24 to chapter 32. In between, you get some of the instruction about the temple and various things, which I will deal with later, because it's really much better to deal with I don't mean the temple, the tabernacle. It's much better to deal with the tabernacle and the liturgy and the priesthood all in one piece, because otherwise it can be very, very confusing. So, but to pick up the story of what happened once Moses went up the mountain, that is extremely important. So this is kind of an introduction to this section, chapters 32, 33, and 34. There's some wonderful teaching in it. I hope you'll have the patience to let me give it to you. And then afterwards, then we can talk about the actual structure of the tent of meeting, the tabernacle, the priesthood, the liturgy, and everything else that makes this a holy, consecrated people. They're not going to be holy until the sin is dealt with. We don't become holy until the sin in our lives is dealt with either. It's not actually possible. As long as the cancer of sin is there, you cannot become holy. The two cannot be together. So this section, chapters 32 to 34, actually deals with what happened to the people when Moses was 40 days up the mountain. Now, Moses didn't know how long he was going to be on the mountain. The people didn't know how long he was going to be on the mountain. So it suddenly turns out to be a trial for the nation. And the trial is to see, would they be faithful to God in the absence of Moses, or were they leaning on Moses 100%? I think we know the answer, that they were leaning on Moses 100% and they had to start growing up spiritually. So there was Moses on the mountain receiving the instruction about how to start a new era of redemption on the earth that would be prophetically wonderful in terms of introducing the era of redemption that Jesus was going to bring us. And the people at the foot of the mountain just seemed to lose everything. They seem to lose their heads altogether. And it's even worse than that. You have the people going to Aaron. Now, Aaron and Hur were left in charge. Okay. And this is how chapter 32 begins. When the people saw that Moses delayed to come down the mountain, the people gathered themselves together to Aaron. Now, the people, that means the leaders. And they said, "Up, make us gods who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we don't know what's happened to him." So, just because Moses is delayed, they decide to go back to paganism. Now, these people have 3 times solemnly declared that they would do God's will, and they ratified a covenant in blood with God. And this is where they're at. They're still at Sinai. Altogether, Moses and the people stayed about a year at Sinai. Up they said, "Make us gods who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we don't know what happened to him." And Aaron said to them, "Take off the rings of gold which are in the ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me." So all the people took off the rings of gold that were in their ears and brought them to Aaron. He received the gold from their hand and fashioned it into a graving tool and made a molten calf. And they said, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up from the land of Egypt." It's mindless. You just say to yourself, now, this can't happen after all that God has actually done for them. And so this Aaron, who is called to the priesthood and is going to be the first high priest, in his very first experience of leadership, commits this dreadful sin. They actually go to him, and it is Aaron who does it. It's incredible. So what you have here then is open apostasy. It's not behind closed doors. It's not a few people sort of having a problem. This is open apostasy against the expressed will of God on the mountain. Now, these people have seen the devouring fire. No wonder they saw the presence of God as a devouring fire. They are very far from God if they are prepared to fall back into paganism at the very first opportunity. But in case you think I'm criticizing them too much, look at the modern world. We think we're very advanced. And look how much paganism has taken over. And they think they're clever. Open apostasy against the commandments. Nowadays, it's fashionable to break the commandments. Anyone who keeps the 10 commandments are called old-fashioned and stuck in the mud and head in the sand. It's only God who can reveal to Moses the greatness of the sin that is actually committed in the apostasy. And we're going to see for the first time God's hatred of sin. He cannot tolerate sin because sin is the destruction of the creature he made. Sin is the cancer that kills us off eternally. A physical cancer in your body can only kill your body. It can't kill you. But sin can destroy you. That's why I gave you Hebrews 12:14 before. Nothing unholy or unworthy can enter the presence of God. I've given you Habakkuk 1:13. God is too holy to look upon sin. So they've met God as the untouchable, holy, pure one. And now they're doing this. So they're going to experience God's wrath for the first time because he wants a holy people, a people like himself. Leviticus 19:2, "You shall be holy, for I am holy, says the Lord." So here you have Moses up in intimate union with God on the mountain and the people in absolute apostasy and sin at the bottom of the mountain. It couldn't be worse if you tried. Looking at this all-holy God in the manifestation he made on Sinai, they had said 3 times all that the Lord has said we will do. What are they doing now? And what's wrong with Aaron? Aaron should have stood up for God. Aaron should have stood up for the covenant. Aaron should have stood up for the truth. And he turns out to be a very, very weak man. So the first thing you notice is that their hearts are not with God. That's Deuteronomy 6:4-10. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one Lord, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with your entire being. That's not where they're at. Not at all. It is unbelievable. And so we're told that they made a golden calf. Now, it is the authors of the book of Exodus that call the idol they made a calf because they want to do that contemptuously. What was actually made was the bull Apis, which was one of the gods of Egypt. And the so-called worship of Apis involved sexual orgies, and so the people going in wild behavior. So what the people have done in making this calf is they've broken the first commandment. I am the Lord your God, you shall not have strange gods before me. Exodus 23:4. The second commandment, you will not make any image of anything in the heavens, the air, the water, or on the ground to worship it. They've broken the second one. I've shown you before from the letter of St. James that if you break one commandment, he says you break the lot. Now, they were going to have a struggle with paganism and falling back into idolatry every time they would actually feel some kind of insecurity. And their insecurity now is that they don't have a clear leader. With the behavior of Aaron, he couldn't possibly be the leader of this people. It's not actually possible. But if you go to the end of the book of Joshua, when Joshua finally leads the younger generation into the promised land, the older generation all died in the wilderness. When he leads them into the promised land and in the end assigns their inheritance to them, he says to them in chapter 24 and verse 14, now therefore, he said, fear the Lord, serve him in sincerity and truth, and put away the gods which your fathers served on the other side of the river and in Egypt. In other words, the people who left Egypt brought their gods with them. When I did the book of Genesis with you, I showed you a similar story when Jacob was leaving his father-in-law's house, that his favorite wife, Rachel, had also brought the household gods with her. So you didn't have this pure faith. This wonderful faith in God is what you find in people like Moses, who have this wonderful relationship with God today. What you have here is that the majority of the people didn't really understand, and they didn't really understand what was going on. And you have the same thing today in the world that we live in, that the majority of people don't really understand the holy religion that we have and the holy life that God has asked us to live. And the tragedy of this people is actually mentioned in Moses' last prayer. And you find this in Deuteronomy 32 from verse 15. And this is at the very end of Moses' life. But Yeshurun, which is a homely way of saying Jacob, waxed fat and kicked. You waxed fat, you grew thick, you became sleek. And he forsook God who made him and scoffed the rock of his salvation. They stirred him to jealousy with strange gods, with abominable practices they provoked him to anger. They sacrificed to demons which were no gods. Now, that's Deuteronomy 32:17. This is coming straight from Moses himself. And this is where St. Paul gets this teaching, which you find in 1 Corinthians 10 and 11, that if you worship a false god, there's no such a thing as a false god. But the demons get involved and you end up worshipping demons. In other words, many of these foul manifestations, which you see in the ancient world, they're these very ugly manifestations. They were manifestations of evil, showing up the worst traits in a human being. And so Moses said it clearly that when you went back to these false gods, you actually ended up worshipping demons. Now, I have to explain that to you, but not in this episode. And so he says that right from the very beginning, they showed this propensity to abandon God. Now, what was their problem with God? Their problem with God was that he was holy and that he was demanding holiness from them. If they were to be his special people, if they were to be a people that he could make a model for all other nations, then they were going to have to be like him. They were going to have to be a people of truth and holiness and love and justice. A people that would be recognized for the great moral strength that is there, because the strength of a nation is the moral strength of its people. And when these people fall badly, they have no strength. Anyone living in grievous sin has no moral strength. We have to be warned. I'll take this up in the next episode. Thank you for listening. Slán agus beannacht déilibh. Goodbye. God bless you.
Thank you for joining us today. We'd like to hear what you thought of today's session. Share your feedback with us at podcast@shalomworld.org. You can motivate and support us today. shalomworld.org/donate. Visit shalomworld.org for more information about Shalom World Podcasts. To get the latest updates, make sure you follow us on Instagram at Shalom World Podcasts. Shalom World Podcasts is now available on all online platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and others.